Quote, "What is good? All that heightens the feeling of power, the will to power, power itself in man. What is bad? All that proceeds from weakness. What is happiness? The feeling that power increases, that a resistance is overcome." Unquote. That's from the Antichrist 2. Will to power might be the most well-known of Nietzsche's ideas. It's also one of the most intriguing and one of the most controversial. Regardless of this, I think it's very poorly understood. For those unfamiliar with it, will to power is Nietzsche's idea that humans don't simply seek contentment, comfort, or self-preservation. We seek challenge, struggle, growth, mastery, even dominance. Power is a concept with which we have an ambiguous and uncomfortable relationship. As I mentioned in episode 3, power is a morally loaded concept in our culture. We associate it with compulsion, domination, oppression, and exploitation. For Nietzsche, these overwhelmingly pejorative associations are a result of what he called our pervasive slave psychology. I'll explain slave psychology in another show, but in brief, we strongly relate to and empathise with positions of powerlessness. And so we associate power with the other guy, someone of whom we are suspicious, intimidated by, and ultimately afraid of. In truth, we all need power, and we continually express power, and we cannot do otherwise. Will to power is not just about brute dominance, though that is one manifestation, nor is it, in fact, a simple psychological drive. In Nietzsche's view, it's a constitutive principle of life itself. Everything, from the most basic organisms to the highest cultural achievements to the laws of physics, is an expression of the will to power. Online, you can find dozens of articles and YouTube videos purporting to explain will to power. But most of the ones I've seen, outside of academia that is, are very superficial. They talk about will to power as if it's just a fact of life. People crave power, people want to rule, people want to dominate others. They concentrate on the stuff that most worries us, those archetypes of Conan the Barbarian, or insane megalomaniac Bond villains, or perhaps Gordon Gekko from the movie Wall Street, champion of social Darwinism, unabashed greed, and rapacious capitalism. What is it that Genghis Khan was supposed to have said? Quote, "The greatest happiness is to scatter your enemy, to drive him before you, to see his cities reduced to ashes, to see those who love him shrouded in tears, and to gather to your bosom his wives and daughters." Unquote. Yes, this is part of will to power, its most extreme cases, but it's not the whole story. Will to power encompasses much, much more. But what is most unsatisfying about these accounts is that these articles and YouTube videos don't explain will to power in any depth. It's just presented as a given, at least a given if you give credence to Nietzsche's doctrine, that is. They don't really explain it. How did it come about? How it works? How it manifests itself in everyday life? And they don't talk about what can be done with this knowledge of will to power. If humans necessarily express will to power, so what? What are we supposed to do with that knowledge? What's the practical significance of this theory of human psychology? These are the questions that we will start to wrestle with in today's show and in the next shows. Will to power is big, and don't be deceived, will to power is deep. Ready to take a roller coaster ride into these depths? Okay, let's do it.
What does not kill me makes me stronger.
You have discovered the Becoming Ubermensch podcast. Becoming Ubermensch is a resource for personal growth and transcendence based on the radical teachings of Friedrich Nietzsche.
Two kingdoms stood peacefully beside each other on opposite sides of a great river. Their kings, great friends, exchanged gifts annually as signs of respect. At first, the gifts were simple: silks, jewels, fine horses. Over the years, the exchanges became more lavish. Gifts became grander, each king striving to surpass the other in the display of his generosity. Vast herds of livestock, chests of gold, entire fleets of ships crossed the water. The kingdoms grew gradually poorer as they emptied their coffers to fund these exchanges. People laboured harder, lived with less, worked night and day to support their regent's spectacular magnanimity. Still, the exchanges continued, each more stupendous than the last. Finally, on a moonless night, one king sent his army covertly across the river to wage a war of annihilation on his arrogant and condescending neighbour. To their surprise, they met the second king's army coming in the other direction. In 1999, the remains of the handsome and dashing adventurer, explorer and mountaineer George Mallory were discovered high on the slopes of Mount Everest at an altitude of 8,155 metres. At that time, it had been 75 years since he and his climbing partner, Andrew Irvine, went missing on the mountain. Due to the year-round sub-zero temperatures, his body was astonishingly well preserved, his skin bleached as white as alabaster. When Mallory set out to climb Everest in June 1924, he carried a photograph of his wife, intending to leave it at the summit. However, when his body was discovered just 700 metres below the summit, no photograph was found. This has fueled speculation that Mallory and Irvine may have reached the top, but, having fallen behind schedule, were descending in darkness when tragedy befell them. Following Mallory's and Irvine's disappearance, it would be another 29 years before Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay made the first confirmed ascent of Everest in 1953. To this day, Mallory's body remains where it was found on the treacherous escarpments of the highest mountain in the world. Its location in the notorious death zone, with its freezing temperatures, high winds and perilously low oxygen levels, makes any recovery of the body completely impractical. In the early 1920s, a reporter had asked George Mallory why he wanted to climb Mount Everest. His reply has since become legendary. Because it's there. Alright, before we dive into Will to Power, let's do a quick recap of what we covered last time. We looked at the problem of desire through an evolutionary lens. We found that our constant craving for more resources, more success, more recognition, is what kept our ancestors alive. In the race for life, the ambitious, restless strivers won out over the more contented individuals, and their genes are the ones we have inherited. That means that dissatisfaction isn't a flaw, it's an inherited predisposition, and it's the evolved engine of progress. We talked about what really drives us. It's not just getting specific things or achieving specific goals, it's the feeling of overcoming resistance to get them. The bigger the challenge, the greater the thrill. I dubbed this cyclical dynamic the wanting, becoming, getting meta drive, which is quite a mouthful, admittedly. This is not the drive to obtain this or that specific thing, but the drive to obtain whatever you want, whatever that is, just for the thrill of obtaining itself. That's why billionaires still chase wealth, why champions keep training after they've won. It's why we set new goals the moment we hit the last one. Nietzsche's word for this relentless wanting, becoming, getting drive is the will to power. It's not just about survival, it's about the joy of winning, achieving, prevailing, growing, expanding our sphere of control, shaping the world in our image and according to our needs and preferences. We talked about why we're never satisfied, why that's no accident. Schopenhauer and the Buddha saw this cycle of desire and suffering and said, "To be alive is bad, and the only way out is to stop wanting anything at all." Nietzsche believed there was something sick about this viewpoint. For a living organism to be born into the world, to be a product of that world, and for it to say no to that very world, is for it to say, meh, existence is not good enough for me. Existence is wrong. It would be better had I never been born. For this organism to reject its own inescapable nature, to want to scurry back into non-existence, well, that for Nietzsche was perverse, nihilism of the most profound kind, in fact, and a clear sign that something had gone very wrong. He writes in Twilight of the Idols 2:2, quote, "Judgments of value concerning life, for it or against it, can in the end never be true. They have value only as symptoms. They are worthy of consideration only as symptoms." Unquote. When he says our judgments are symptoms, he means that our judgments of the world say more about us than they do about the world. I recall a quote from Aleister Crowley here. Quote, "The world is a mirror in which he who sees muck is muck." Unquote. Nietzsche would agree, I think. Also, didn't the Buddha say, quote, "With our thoughts we create the world"? Unquote. How is that reconciled with his judgment that, quote, "all life is suffering"? Unquote. I don't know enough about the Buddha to say so, but if you do, perhaps get in touch with the show. Someone who feels gratitude for life and for the world is, in a sense, on Nietzsche's terms, healthier and fitter than someone who thinks it's a curse and an abomination. The former deserves life, and the latter deserves that which they crave, annihilation. Now, don't get me wrong, when I say deserves, this is not to speak morally, but in terms of evolution by natural selection. Over the long term, the fit will tend to flourish and propagate themselves. The degenerate will tend to perish. That's just a logical necessity, and ever was it thus. This is not to say, of course, that we should be Pollyannas, pretending the world is all balloons and lollipops. It's frequently a tough place of struggle and strife, pain and horror, no doubt. But Nietzsche asks, what if one could wholeheartedly affirm that struggle, that strife, and even that horror and pain? When we instead reject the world and the cycle of desire that being alive necessarily entails, as if we've been born into some kind of hell, we don't just reject the world, we reject ourselves. Indeed, we reject the essential character of all life and all existence, which is, you guessed it, will to power. Remember Nietzsche's words from Thus Spoke Zarathustra, quote, "Remain faithful to the earth," unquote. Which brings me to today's topic. What is will to power? We've been talking here about will to power in human psychology, but really this is just one aspect of it. The precise nature of Nietzsche's concept continues to be a matter of debate among scholars, but generally its character and scope are interpreted in three ways. Firstly, as something psychological, which is as we've been discussing it. In this interpretation, will to power concerns the behaviour of humans, including human societies, and possibly other complex living organisms that exhibit sophisticated patterns of behaviour. Secondly, as something organic. In this interpretation, will to power is expressed in all living things, whether animals, plants, fungi or microorganisms, inasmuch as they appear to strive and compete to survive, grow and reproduce in the world. This interpretation of will to power bears a passing resemblance to the old evolutionary notion of survival of the fittest. We've touched on this interpretation to some degree, at least in humans, by exploring the development of will to power as an inevitable consequence of evolution by natural selection. Thirdly, as something metaphysical. In this broadest interpretation, will to power is the all-pervading, all-encompassing principle undergirding existence itself, including both the organic and inorganic realms. This interpretation asserts that everything is will to power, whether it be solar flares, thunderstorms, or a rock rolling down a hill. Nietzsche stated this metaphysical idea most explicitly when he wrote, quote, "Would you have a name for my world? a solution of all your riddles? Do you also want to light you most concealed, strongest, and most undaunted men of the blackest midnight? The world is will to power, and nothing else, and even you yourselves are this will to power, and nothing besides." Unquote. That's in the collection of unpublished notes, and it's section 1067. This last is the most controversial interpretation, even in the academic literature, and it is actively rejected by many commentators who think Nietzsche got a little overexcited with his will to power hypothesis. I think they are quite wrong in this. Will to power can explain just about everything, in my view, but we'll not go so far today, confining ourselves to the case of human psychology for the time being. I've been explicating this psychological interpretation as it manifests itself in the wanting, becoming, getting drive. I also claimed that the imperative of survival for reproduction of genes is the fundamental imperative of all life, with wanting, becoming, getting, or what we will now be recognizing as psychological will to power, being a propensity that evolved to serve it, just as every other characteristic of all living species serves it. But notice something. Doesn't this make psychological will to power a secondary dynamic, dependent on the survival for reproduction imperative, existing only because it evolved to serve that imperative? But Nietzsche argues that will to power is an explanatory principle, something foundational and fundamental. How can it be fundamental if it evolved to serve survival for reproduction? Let's park this question for the time being. I've argued that psychological will to power is the desire for overcoming resistance, and there is a broad consensus in the academic literature to support this. This psychological dynamic generally contributes strongly to the imperative for life, promoting the survival for reproduction of one's genes. But because psychological will to power is a drive that has evolved only to pursue its own satisfaction, it often seems to have broken its bounds, sometimes even working in ways that seem contrary to survival for reproduction. Remember, like all instinctive drives, will to power in itself is blind, non-purposive, non-teleological. It has no goals beyond expressing itself. In its psychological manifestation, it evolved because it contributed to survival for reproduction, but it does not aim at that as some kind of goal. An analogy would be something like the introduction of European rabbits in Australia in the 1800s, primarily for sport hunting and for food. The unexpected consequences of this were that the rabbits rapidly multiplied, severely damaging native vegetation, causing erosion, habitat destruction, and ecological collapse. The point here is that the intended function of the introduction programme and the actual effects are quite separate things. The people who introduced the rabbits had a goal, but for the rabbits themselves, their only goal, if you can call it that, was to do what rabbits do. In the same way, psychological will to power evolved because it usually serves survival for reproduction, but it does not aim at it. Will to power just does what will to power does, seeking ever more satisfaction in chasing and obtaining power over and over. As Nietzsche wrote in Beyond Good and Evil 13, responding to what he saw as the Darwinists' position, quote, "Physiologists should think again before postulating the drive to self-preservation as the cardinal drive in an organic being. A living thing desires above all to vent its strength. Life as such is will to power. Self-preservation is only one of the most indirect and most frequent consequences of it." Unquote. Feeling the unconscious impetus of our will to power, it is us humans who, after the fact, consciously furnish goals for ourselves to serve the impulse. So what I mean is, you have a blind, inalienable drive to overcome. That's will to power as your instinct. So you then consciously and purposefully, say, take up tennis in order to give vent to that unconscious impulse. The will to power drive is blind, but your conscious mind, which does the bidding of your instincts, is not. It exercises foresight. It is profoundly purposive. It is teleological to a fault. Really, It only works if it can conceive of goals. And so, in response to the insistent, unconscious will-to-power drive, your conscious mind comes up with some concrete goals to express that inherent motivation. You might recognize this process as that distinctly human foible, rationalization. Rationalization is that psychological mechanism in which people unconsciously create plausible-sounding explanations or justifications for behaviours, decisions or feelings that actually arise from unconscious, irrational, emotional or instinctive motives. So we take up tennis or bridge or macrame in order to have conceivable goals. But because no success can ever be truly and finally definitive, and all fulfillment from achieving a goal tends to fade, so-called hedonic adaptation, you must soon find other goals. This is confusing for us. Why does the thing you wanted so much, winning the local tennis league, seem to depreciate in value once you have it? The answer is that the goal was never really the thing that was driving you. It was a conscious proxy for an unconscious impulse. The irresistible expression of the will-to-power dynamic was the true motivation, and this impulse pursues relentless overcoming, the unending transformation of wanting into getting. So a success, as welcome as that is, cannot be enough, at least not for long. What happens here is you confuse the proxy, winning the local tennis league, with the real underlying motivation, the expression of the will-to-power drive. So, now I guess it looks like you'll have to try out for the regional tennis league. And so it goes. Because of this disconnect, the will-to-power can manifest itself in struggles to overcome that seem to be contrary to life's end of survival for reproduction. Consider dangerous adventure sports, for example. They might satisfy the will-to-power drive, but may actually reduce your chances of survival for reproduction, or more correctly, the survival for reproduction of your genes. This brings us back to that famous mountaineer we spoke of at the start of the show, George Mallory.
The Becoming Übermensch project is a new and tender green shoot striving towards the light. If it's going to thrive, it needs the sunshine and gentle rain of your support. If you find this material of value, help us to help you by doing a few simple things. Hit follow so you don't miss the next episode. Follow us on Instagram, TikTok, YouTube, Facebook and X. Search Becoming Übermensch, all one word. Drop us a review. We'd love to hear your feedback. And if you know people who'd get something from this podcast, please do share it with them. Your support makes all the difference and can help this project survive and flourish.
When, in the early 1920s, George Mallory was asked why he wanted to climb Everest, he was being asked to provide a rationale for an impulse that was not, at its core, even remotely explicable in rational terms. That's why his reply is so absurd and yet so utterly relatable. Because it's there. He may as well have said, because I want to. Why did he want to climb Everest? Just because. The explanation for this most impractical and irrational of becauses lies in the will-to-power drive. Mallory hungered for the unimaginable exhilaration that would be the victor's prize at the end of this monumental exercise in overcoming resistance. Will-to-power explains the appeal of dangerous and impractical activities like mountain climbing. It may be true that there are real-world benefits to success in such endeavours, fame, high social status, a sponsorship deal from an outdoor equipment company perhaps, but these may be considered subsidiary to the pure exhilaration of pushing oneself beyond the limits of what one believed one was capable of. George Mallory could have stayed at home with his beautiful wife and his 3 children. At some level, he must have wanted that. But the greater desire involved overcoming the appeal of this comfortable, genteel, upper-class existence and risking it all for the chance of extraordinary glory, to be the first to summit the highest mountain in the world. People possess the will-to-power drive in varying degrees. Or would it be truer to say are possessed by it to varying degrees? We all want, but some want much, much more than others. Personally, we might crave only the modest triumph of a victory in a quiet game of chess, or the validation of a well done from our boss at work. Whatever the case, there is another feature of the hedonic adaptation discussed above that has significant implications for us and the happiness we seek. We've noted that the pleasure of success in getting what we want fades over time. But to make matters even more testing, our pleasure in getting what we want tends to be subject to diminishing returns too. Like a drug addict, we need to find bigger and bigger doses of the drug, success, in order to enjoy the same intensity of pleasure. This often leads us to take on ever more challenging goals. Consider Mallory once more. Let me read out a list of the notable peaks he summited in the years leading up to his Everest expedition. 1904, Mont Velan, Switzerland. 1904, Grand Combin, Switzerland. 1904, Dent Blanche, Switzerland. 1911, Mont Blanc, Switzerland. After a long hiatus caused by the First World War, in which Mallory served as a British officer, he resumed mountaineering, attempting ascents of Everest from 1921. So 1921, British reconnaissance expedition around Everest, reaching the North Col. 1922, British Mount Everest expedition on Everest, reaching the North Ridge. 1924, British Mount Everest expedition, Mallory's final ascent. Okay, succession of peaks there, but now let me read out the altitudes of the peaks he summited in the same chronological order. 1904, 3,727 metres. Then 4,314 metres. 4,357 metres. 4,808 metres. 7,020 metres. 8,170 metres. And then he was last seen by a teammate at approximately 8,570 metres. That's less than 300 metres from the summit of Everest. See the way the altitudes unfailingly ascend with each expedition. We catch a glimpse of Mallory's burgeoning ambition in the heights of the peaks he scaled, one after the other, each higher than the last. What could serve as a better illustration of the tendency of will to power to be compelled to seek ever greater gratifications? It's a demand of life that the future should exceed the past, that our lives are getting better and better, that our achievements should accumulate and grow. That is, if our lives are to be as fulfilled as possible. Nobody wants to be less happy in the future than they are in the present or were in the past. As we proved in our early shows, to want less happiness is to want what you don't want and cannot want. The irrepressible nature of will to power does not mean, of course, that everyone is driven to climb mountains. Many expect much less from life, if only because less is all they can reasonably expect from it. Many privilege comfort and safety too much to risk life and limb in the way that Mallory did. Indeed, some attempt to evade all struggle and live a life of comfort and safety and the most basic pleasures. Like the world deniers, Buddha and Schopenhauer, Nietzsche spies signs of ill health here too. He called such a type the last man, and we'll discuss Nietzsche's last man and the decadence he embodies in a future episode. The last man aside, for many a more simple life with fewer needs and what seems to us to be relatively modest goals can be an achievement too, something worth striving for. The fact is that Nietzsche's higher man or woman determines their own way of life, on their own terms, regardless of anyone else's judgments or ideas about what success in life should look like. As Nietzsche writes, quote, "I have found strength where one does not look for it, in simple, mild and pleasant people, without the least desire to rule, and, conversely, the desire to rule has often appeared to me a sign of inward weakness. They fear their own slave soul and shroud it in a royal cloak. In the end, they still become the slaves of their followers, their fame, etc. The powerful natures dominate. It is a necessity. They need not lift a finger, even if during their lifetime they bury themselves in a garden house." unquote. And that's from Nietzsche's notes from around 1880. One can become a kind of slave to one's own will to power. Just because the higher man or woman can have it all, it doesn't mean they will choose to. And there's a critical difference here between choosing not to act and not being able to act. Remember, the greatest power that one can possess is power over one's self. It is not just mountains of rock that can be climbed, but mountains of the mind too. In particular, the artist is a type that Nietzsche sees as a ripe candidate for becoming a higher individual. And speaking of art and artists, let's turn to this week's music choice. Nietzsche is the philosopher of music, of dancing, of art, of the aesthetic, of feeling. And so I recommend a track every week that reflects the moods and emotions of this Becoming Übermensch project, at least as I see them. So I invite you to have your own feeling experience framed within the project we are exploring whilst listening to Featherweight Kid by Crippling Alcoholism. This is a dark track from a dark album, somehow moving and horrific at the same time. It captures something about the irrepressible human spirit and, at the same time, its potential for degradation too. Be warned, this is not music for the prim, but then this is not really a podcast for the prim. Links, as always, are in the show's description. Do share your thoughts on how this track made you feel. I'd be really interested in hearing about your impressions. We're running out of time today, and there is so much more to explore. So let's crystallise the dynamic of psychological will to power so we can get a handle on it and consider how we might best deal with its demands and utilise it productively to improve our lives. You want things. You have goals which you value for their practical benefits, but you also want things and have goals just because you crave the pleasure of getting and achieving. This is a psychological trait of will to power. But will to power doesn't have any goals apart from its own satisfaction, which is the feeling of increased power from getting what has been pursued. Will to power craves the activity of pursuing and achieving goals itself. What the goal is not especially important to will to power. There are 3 important conditions, however. Firstly, the harder the goal is to achieve, the greater the resistance that will be encountered in trying to achieve it, the greater the pleasure that can be experienced in success. This is that economic principle of value being proportional to scarcity. The rarer is the more valued. Let's call this the resistance-reward principle. Secondly, the feelings of fulfillment we feel in achieving any goal are likely to be temporary as the will to power drive continues to make its demands. Consequently, following success, at some point, the warm glow of triumph cools and a new goal must be identified which can be sought after. This is our principle of hedonic adaptation. Thirdly, the pleasure derived from success is subject to diminishing returns, weakening with each subsequent achievement unless the challenge or resistance grows proportionally greater. Like an addict developing tolerance, we find ourselves requiring ever larger doses of success to experience the same intensity of pleasure. Consequently, we're driven to pursue increasingly ambitious and demanding goals. We could call this principle hedonic escalation. Last week, we compared our unending pursuit of happiness to the predicament of Sisyphus, the guy from Greek myth forced to push a huge boulder up a steep hill only to see it roll back to the bottom again every time. Well, it seems our situation is even worse. To achieve a state of perfect fulfillment, not only do we have to start rolling the boulder afresh each time, but it needs to be a bigger boulder each time and a steeper hill every time. But no, the worst part of Sisyphus's punishment is that the boulder rolling is meaningless. The pursuit of our own goals usually isn't and shouldn't be. Indeed, humans often don't resent a struggle as long as it's for something meaningful, something they deem worthwhile. As Nietzsche writes in Twilight of Idols 1:12, quote, "If you have your why in life, you can get along with almost any how," unquote. Still, it's useful to understand how this dynamic works. We are subject to the demands of will to power mediated by resistance reward, hedonic adaptation, and hedonic escalation. This is knowledge that we can potentially leverage to help us understand our own needs and the motivations of others. Consider our tennis player who wins the local league. It feels good for a while, but the pleasure fades as a result of hedonic adaptation. Then, in order to satisfy their insatiable will-to-power drive, our player may feel compelled to compete at a regional level, where there will be more intense competition and the potential for greater pleasure in triumph, the resistance-reward principle. Experiencing success once more, the same dynamic may make itself felt, so they then set their sights on the nationals, then the internationals, perhaps in the most exceptional of cases, taking gold at the Olympics. In this, we can see a clear trajectory of hedonic escalation. But what then? Well, that's when our world champion starts coaching other wannabes to achieve success. Yes, will to power often involves the pleasure in nurturing and supporting others, in bestowing on them. As Nietzsche writes of power in Daybreak 356, quote, "The most common modes of expression are to bestow, to mock, to destroy, all three out of a common basic drive," unquote. And in Beyond Good and Evil 260, quote, "The feeling of plenitude, of power which seeks to overflow, the happiness of high tension, the consciousness of a wealth which would like to give away and bestow," unquote. Here then we see for Nietzsche that even in beneficence, will to power can often be discerned. And it's true. Doesn't giving usually make you feel proud, capable, magnanimous? These are feelings of power by any reasonable standard. But perhaps you disagree. I guess the question is, what is power? We will be confronting that crucial question, but we're almost out of time for today. So let me recommend for you an exercise for the next week. But, of course, here's an important reminder. As with any and all experiments or exercises I share with you, it's crucial that you take full responsibility for your choices and your experiences. I don't recommend these things to you because I don't know you. So if you decide to try these things, that's a decision you must take full responsibility for. If you can't take full responsibility for yourself, then I strongly recommend that you don't try them. If you can't take full responsibility for yourself, then you may not really be ready for Nietzsche's teachings. So with that said, here's the exercise. I'm calling it Choose Your Resistance. Step 1. Identify one meaningful resistance. Pick one concrete thing you've been avoiding, something small but personally challenging. It could be having a difficult conversation you've been postponing. It could be starting a daily habit like exercise or meditation. Or it could be taking on a minor challenge at work or at home, for instance, speaking up at a meeting, fixing something broken, or tackling an unpleasant chore you've been avoiding. Step 2. Consciously embrace it. Deliberately face this resistance within the next 7 days. As you engage, pay close attention to how you feel at the exact moment you choose to confront rather than avoid the challenge. Notice how your emotional state changes as you begin to overcome this resistance, or alternatively, as you fail to overcome the resistance. Step 3. Reflect briefly. Immediately afterwards, answer these quick questions mentally or write them down. How did it feel to overcome or not overcome that resistance? What effect did it have on your sense of self immediately afterwards? Did you feel an urge to take on another challenge afterwards? Was there an increase or decrease in your confidence? Watch out for rationalizations. So excuses like, "Oh, I didn't overcome the resistance, but it was because of A, B, and C, which were out of my control." You are not going to share this stuff, so be scrupulously honest with yourself. Try to be descriptive, not interpretive. Avoid moralizing or making judgments of yourself. Your description should not include words like ought or should. Through this exercise, you can start to develop a conscious awareness and relationship with your own will to power drive. Understanding it can enable you to have a healthier and more fulfilling relationship with it. To conclude, Nietzsche's will to power goes far beyond simple desire for dominance. It is a fundamental psychological drive expressing itself through the continuous pursuit and overcoming of resistance. Humans set goals consciously, but beneath these rational aims is the unconscious craving to feel power by achieving and overcoming challenges. The more difficult a goal, the greater the resistance that will be encountered, the more intense the pleasure of success. Yet satisfaction is fleeting, compelling us to continually seek new goals. Furthermore, each success provides diminishing returns, driving us to pursue increasingly ambitious challenges, ratcheting up the level of challenge each time, echoing the myth of Sisyphus, but with an ever larger boulder and an ever steeper hill each time. Will to power, although it evolved to promote survival, it doesn't always serve this end. It simply seeks its own expression, often manifesting in seemingly irrational pursuits, exemplified by George Mallory's perilous quest to climb Everest, because it's there. Understanding will to power means recognizing this unconscious motivation behind our ambitions and struggles. By doing so, we gain insights into our desires, enabling us to choose meaningful resistances consciously, leveraging will to power constructively. Nietzsche invites us not merely to endure struggle, but to embrace it willingly, living with intensity through the continual, meaningful overcoming of resistances. Next week, we will be offering an alternative hierarchy of needs to the one proposed by Abraham Maslow, a more fundamental hierarchy of needs based on will to power. And we'll explore will to power in its more organic manifestations, examining its significance for us in living our most fulfilled lives. All this on the way to that most profound and comprehensive of interpretations of the will to power, Nietzsche's purported solution of all our riddles, the world as the will to power and nothing else. And you too, will to power and nothing else. Don't forget to show the podcast some love by liking, following, subscribing, commenting, reviewing, and all that good stuff. It really makes a difference, believe me. If you value it, support it in whatever way you can. So, that said, join me next time for episode 10, Nietzsche's new hierarchy of needs. Until then, live dangerously.